Welcome to Mystery Minds, where the most chilling and unsolved true crime stories come to life. If you're fascinated by the dark side of human nature and the mysteries that keep us awake at night, you're in the right place. In every episode, we dive deep into real-life cases, unraveling the twists, the secrets, and the shocking truths. Get ready to explore the unknown because at Mystery Minds, the answers are never as simple as they seem. Clara Rayner, a young girl with dreams of a better life, was sold to the powerful and charming Thomas Rayner, a man whose wealth and influence hid a terrifying secret. But Clara wasn't the first to disappear from his grasp, and she wouldn't be the last. What really happened behind the gates of his mansion? Join us as we unravel the dark tale of manipulation, betrayal, and murder that shocked a town and changed everything. In the small rural town, life was slow-moving and steeped in tradition. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where gossip traveled faster than the weather shifted. But beneath the surface of its peaceful facade, hardship lingered in many homes. For the Lewis family, these struggles were constant companions. Clara Lewis, the eldest of 3 siblings, carried much of this burden on her young shoulders. At just 16, Clara was wise beyond her years, shaped by the challenges of growing up in poverty. Her father, Gerald, was a laborer who took whatever work he could find, but his income was unstable. Clara's mother, Helen, earned a meager living sewing clothes for wealthier families in town. Despite their efforts, the family often went to bed with empty stomachs, their meager savings drained by unexpected expenses. Clara tried to find hope in education, believing it could offer her a brighter future. She was an exceptional student, excelling in her studies despite the odds. She spent her evenings studying by the light of a single candle, her textbooks worn but treasured. Her teachers spoke highly of her, saying she had the potential to achieve great things if given the opportunity. For Clara, school was not just a place to learn, it was a sanctuary from the harsh realities of her life. However, the Lewis family's situation took a turn for the worse when Gerald suffered an accident while working on a construction site. A falling beam left him with a broken leg, rendering him unable to work for months. With medical bills mounting and no steady income, the family quickly fell behind on their mortgage. The threat of losing their home loomed over them, and the once hopeful atmosphere in their household gave way to despair. It was during this desperate time that Thomas Rayner appeared in their lives. Thomas was a wealthy landowner who had lived in the town for decades. He was a tall, imposing man with a reputation that preceded him. At 65 years old, he was respected for his business acumen, but regarded with suspicion for his peculiar lifestyle. He rarely ventured into town and lived alone in a sprawling estate surrounded by dense woods. Many townsfolk whispered about his failed marriages and the strange aura that seemed to follow him. When Thomas approached the Lewis family, he came under the guise of a benefactor. He claimed to have heard about their financial troubles and offered to pay off their debts. His proposal, however, came with a condition: he wanted Clara to become his wife. He presented the arrangement as a win-win situation. Clara would live in comfort, free from poverty, and her family would no longer face the threat of homelessness. Helen and Gerald were initially horrified by the suggestion, but their desperation made them vulnerable to persuasion. Thomas spoke with confidence, painting a picture of a bright future for Clara. He assured them she would be well cared for, that she would have access to everything she needed to live a good life. Despite their unease, the prospect of financial relief was too tempting to ignore. Clara's parents agonized over the decision for days, but as creditors grew more aggressive, they convinced themselves it was the only solution. They rationalized their choice by focusing on what they believed were the benefits for Clara: a stable home, a chance to escape poverty, and the protection of a wealthy husband. Deep down, though, they knew they were betraying her trust. Clara was not consulted about the arrangement. When her parents finally informed her, she was devastated. She begged them to reconsider, but her protests were dismissed. Helen, with tears in her eyes, told Clara that sacrifices had to be made for the family's survival. Gerald avoided her gaze, his guilt evident but buried beneath the weight of his decision. The day Thomas came to collect Clara was somber and quiet. The family stood outside their modest home, avoiding eye contact as Clara stepped into Thomas's sleek black car. She carried a small suitcase containing her few belongings: a faded dress, a notebook, and a photograph of her siblings. Her younger brother and sister waved innocently, unaware of the gravity of what was happening. As the car drove away, Clara looked out the window, her heart heavy with a mix of fear and resignation. The familiar sights of her hometown disappeared, replaced by the dense forest that surrounded Thomas's estate. She felt as though she were being swallowed by the trees, their shadows stretching across the road like claws. The estate came into view, its grandeur stark against the wild landscape. It was an enormous mansion, its stone facade covered in ivy and its windows reflecting the dim evening light. The wrought iron gates opened slowly, creaking as if to announce her arrival. Inside, the air was heavy with silence. The estate was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. The hallways were lined with antique furniture and gilded mirrors, but the beauty was overshadowed by an eerie sense of emptiness. It felt more like a museum than a home. The staff, a housekeeper and a gardener, greeted her briefly before disappearing. Their expressions were unreadable, their movements stiff. Clara's room was lavishly furnished with a canopy bed, velvet curtains, and ornate rugs. But it didn't feel like a gift. The barred windows and locked door made it clear that this was a cage, no matter how beautiful it appeared. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the photograph of her siblings, her tears soaking into the delicate fabric of her dress. She realized then that her life was no longer her own. She had been sold, her future traded for financial stability. The weight of her parents' betrayal and the reality of her isolation pressed down on her like a heavy stone. But in the quiet of that gilded room, Clara made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let her spirit be broken, even if escape seemed impossible. The estate loomed large in Clara's life, a constant reminder of the life she had been forced into. From the moment she arrived, she felt the suffocating weight of its silence. The grandeur of the mansion, with its intricate woodwork and glittering chandeliers, did little to disguise the unease that crept through its halls. Clara had imagined that such a place would bring comfort, but instead it amplified her loneliness and fear. Her days followed a rigid routine imposed by Thomas. Mornings began with meals served in the vast dining room, where the food was extravagant but tasteless to her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brandt, set the tone for the rest of the staff, polite but detached, avoiding unnecessary interaction. Clara wasn't sure if their coldness stemmed from fear of Thomas or indifference to her plight. Either way, it deepened her sense of isolation. Thomas made it clear that Clara was to remain within the estate. The surrounding woods, though beautiful, served as a natural barrier, and the heavy iron gates were always locked. There was no escape. Clara's every move was monitored, her boundaries enforced not only by Thomas's rules but also by the ever-watchful eyes of the staff. The mansion itself felt alive, its creaking floors and groaning walls carrying an air of menace. Clara explored the rooms cautiously, trying to acquaint herself with her surroundings, but certain doors were locked and strictly off-limits. The library became her sanctuary, a grand room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the smell of aged paper. Here she would lose herself in stories of faraway places, temporarily escaping the reality of her life. But even the library couldn't shield her from the strange atmosphere of the house. The paintings that adorned the walls seemed to follow her with their unblinking gazes, their subjects frozen in expressions that were neither welcoming nor hostile, but unsettlingly in between. At night, the house grew even more oppressive. The flickering lights of the chandeliers cast long, wavering shadows, and faint noises echoed through the halls. Clara often lay awake, staring at the barred windows, wondering what might be lurking in the darkness beyond her door. The staff's behavior added to the mystery. Mrs. Brandt, the housekeeper, rarely spoke to Clara unless absolutely necessary, and the gardener, a wiry man in his 50s, avoided her altogether. There was an unspoken tension that hung over the household, as though everyone were keeping a secret. Clara noticed how quickly conversations stopped when she entered her room, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more about Thomas and her fate than they let on. Thomas's demeanor shifted unpredictably. At times he was cordial, almost doting, showering Clara with gifts or insisting she wear the expensive dresses he provided. But beneath this facade of generosity was a controlling nature that grew more apparent with each passing day. He dictated what she could wear, what she could eat, and even how she spent her time. Any attempt to assert her independence was met with thinly veiled threats or chilling silence. Clara soon realized that Thomas was not just a man of strict rules, but one with a dark side he tried to hide behind his wealth and charm. His presence filled every room he entered, a silent demand for submission, the slightest misstep a delayed response, A misplaced item could send his mood spiraling into quiet rage. Clara began to tread carefully, learning to anticipate his moods and avoid provoking him. Amid her confinement, Clara's curiosity about the locked doors in the mansion grew stronger. Why were certain areas of the house forbidden? What secrets did they hold? One day, as she roamed the halls, she noticed a faint light seeping from beneath a door that was usually locked. It was ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it completely. She hesitated before stepping inside. The room was a study, lined with shelves full of books and documents. On the large mahogany desk were neatly arranged papers and an old-fashioned lamp. Clara's eyes were drawn to a drawer slightly cracked open. Inside, she found photographs, sepia-toned images of two women. Their faces were unfamiliar, but their expressions seemed to echo her own sense of despair. Clara studied the photographs closely, her heart pounding. She realized these must be Thomas's former wives. She had heard vague references to them during her first days at the estate, but no one spoke of them in detail. The staff seemed to avoid the topic entirely, and Thomas dismissed her questions with curt answers. The discovery of the photographs only fueled her unease. Clara began to sense a pattern. Thomas's first wife, Eleanor, had reportedly left him years ago, though no one seemed to know the circumstances of her departure. His second wife, Margaret, was said to have died of an illness, but the details were equally vague. Now, Clara feared that whatever had happened to them could happen to her. Her isolation intensified as the weeks turned into months. Clara tried to contact her family, but Thomas had cut off all her avenues of communication. Her letters went unanswered, and the phone in the study was locked away. She felt as though she had been erased from the outside world, her existence confined to the cold walls of the mansion. Clara's once bright spirit began to dim, but she refused to let it extinguish completely. She became more observant, noting every detail of the house and the people within it. She began to look for patterns in Thomas's behavior, for any weakness she might exploit. Though the walls of the estate felt insurmountable, Clara quietly resolved to find a way out. As the days dragged on, Clara felt the weight of the mansion's secrets pressing down on her. The locked doors, the mysterious photographs, and the tension in the air all pointed to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened to Eleanor and Margaret, she would not let it be her fate. Clara's disappearance sent shockwaves through the estate, but the reaction felt more like a performance than genuine concern. Thomas was quick to report her missing, claiming she had run away in the middle of the night. He explained to the authorities that Clara had always been restless and unhappy, suggesting she might have returned to her family or sought freedom elsewhere. His composed demeanor and influential status ensured that his version of events was taken at face value. The staff corroborated his story, whether out of fear or loyalty. Miss Brandt recounted hearing Claire arguing with Thomas the evening before she disappeared, though her account conveniently had any implication of foul play. The gardener mentioned seeing Clara wandering near the edge of the property days prior, hinting at her supposed desire to leave. To outsiders, it appeared as though Clara had simply vanished of her own accord. The police conducted a cursory investigation, visiting the estate and questioning Thomas briefly. They combed through Clara's belongings and examined the grounds, but their search yielded nothing substantial. Without evidence of a crime, they had little reason to suspect Thomas of wrongdoing. The case was filed as a missing persons report, and the search for Clara slowly lost momentum. Back in town, Clara's parents were devastated. When Thomas informed them of her disappearance, he feigned concern, offering reassurances that he had done everything he could to find her. Helen and Gerald were racked with guilt, realizing too late the consequences of their decision. They pleaded with the police to dig deeper, but their cries for help were met with indifference. To the authorities, Clara was just another runaway young girl trying to escape her circumstances. As weeks turned into months, Clara's name faded from conversations in the town. Life moved on, and the tragedy of her disappearance became a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. But while the town seemed to forget, one person couldn't let go of the mystery: Emily Harper, a young journalist from a neighboring city. Emily had a knack for uncovering hidden truths, her investigative instincts sharpened by years of chasing difficult stories. She stumbled upon Clara's case while researching a series of articles about vulnerable women in isolated communities. The circumstances surrounding Clara's disappearance struck her as odd, particularly Thomas's quick dismissal of the situation and the eerie parallels to the fates of his two previous wives. Emily began her investigation by gathering every piece of information she could find. She interviewed townsfolk, piecing together Clara's life before her marriage to Thomas. What she found was a picture of a bright, ambitious girl who had been forced into an unimaginable situation. The more she learned about Clara's circumstances, the more convinced Emily became that her disappearance was no accident. Her next step was to look into Thomas's history. She discovered that Eleanor, his first wife, had seemingly disappeared without explanation. Official records stated she had left the marriage voluntarily, but there were no documented sightings of her after she left the estate. Margaret, his second wife, had died under mysterious circumstances. Though her death was attributed to illness, Emily found no medical records to support the claim. Determined to find answers, Emily traveled to the estate, posing as a researcher interested in the architecture of the mansion. Thomas, ever the narcissist, was happy to show off his home to someone who appeared to admire his taste. Emily used this opportunity to explore the property, noting its labyrinthine layout and the oppressive atmosphere that Clara had described in her letters to friends before her disappearance. As she wandered through the house, Emily felt the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. She noticed the locked doors, the barred windows, and the unsettling artwork that seemed to watch her every move. During her guided tour, she managed to slip away from Thomas and found herself in the basement. The air was cold and damp, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. Emily's flashlight illuminated a row of storage trunks, each labeled with a name. Her breath caught when she saw two familiar names, Eleanor and Margaret. Her hands trembled as she opened the trunks. Inside were personal belongings, jewelry, clothing, letters, items that should have been returned to their families, but had instead been hidden away. Among the items, Emily found a blood-stained handkerchief that sent chills down her spine. The discovery confirmed her suspicions. Something terrible had happened to Thomas's former wives, and Clara's disappearance was likely connected. As she continued her search, Emily uncovered a hidden door at the back of the basement. It led to a small, dark cellar that reeked of decay. In one corner, partially buried beneath a pile of rubble, she found a piece of fabric, a fragment of a dress that matched descriptions of the one Clara had been wearing when she was last seen. Emily's heart raced as she photographed the evidence and carefully documented her findings. She knew she had to act quickly. She left the estate unnoticed and contacted the authorities, presenting them with her evidence. Reluctantly, they agreed to reopen the case and conduct a more thorough investigation of the estate. When the police returned to the property, they uncovered more than Emily could have imagined. Beneath the cellar floor, they discovered human remains, 3 bodies in various states of decomposition. Dental records confirmed their identities as Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara. Each had suffered violent deaths, their lives stolen by the man who had vowed to care for them. The case against Thomas was undeniable. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, they uncovered years of manipulation, abuse, and murder. Thomas had hidden his crimes behind a veneer of wealth and respectability, but his monstrous nature was finally laid bare. The town, once complicit in their silence, was forced to confront the horrors that had unfolded in their midst. The trial of Thomas Rayner became the most talked-about event in the region, drawing national attention for its chilling details. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and the families of the victims. Everyone wanted to hear the twisted story of how a wealthy and respected man had hidden such heinous crimes in plain sight. Thomas, now a shadow of the confident man he once was, appeared in court wearing an expression that alternated between indignation and detachment. His lawyers painted him as a misunderstood individual, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and that he was being targeted because of his wealth. They attempted to cast doubt on Emily Harper's findings, insinuating that her investigative methods were intrusive and biased. However, the prosecution had built a damning case. The remains of Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara had been recovered from beneath the cellar floor of Thomas's estate. Forensic analysis revealed that all 3 women had died violently, their injuries consistent with strangulation and blunt force trauma. The blood-stained handkerchief Emily had found in the basement tested positive for Clara's DNA, tying Thomas directly to her murder. Witnesses were called to testify, and their accounts painted a grim picture of Thomas's true character. Former staff members from his estate described his controlling and erratic behavior, recounting incidents where he had lost his temper over minor infractions. Mrs. Brandt reluctantly admitted under cross-examination that she had suspected something was wrong but feared speaking out. Her testimony revealed the culture of fear that permeated the household, where loyalty to Thomas was enforced through intimidation. Clara's parents also took the stand, their faces etched with guilt and grief. They spoke about the financial desperation that had led them to agree to the marriage, emphasizing their belief that Clara would be safe with Thomas. Their testimony was met with mixed reactions. Some sympathized with their plight, while others criticized their decision to send Clara into harm's way. The most compelling testimony came from Emily Harper herself. She recounted her investigation in meticulous detail, presenting the evidence she had uncovered at the estate. Her photographs of the basement, the blood-stained handkerchief, and the personal belongings of the previous wives left little room for doubt. Emily's calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to the truth made a powerful impression on the jury. As the trial progressed, the prosecution revealed additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of Thomas's past. Financial records showed that he had systematically drained the resources of each of his wives, transferring their assets into his accounts before their disappearances. The prosecution argued that Thomas had married these women not out of love but as part of a calculated plan to exploit and ultimately dispose of them. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. They attempted to discredit the forensic findings, suggesting that the remains could have been planted to frame Thomas. However, their arguments were weak, and the jury was unconvinced. The cold, hard facts spoke louder than any attempt at misdirection. Throughout the trial, Thomas maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. He showed no remorse for his actions, even as the details of his crimes were laid bare. His lack of empathy only solidified the public's perception of him as a remorseless predator. The trial lasted for weeks, but the jury's deliberation was surprisingly swift. After just a few hours, they returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts, including multiple charges of murder, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The judge sentenced Thomas to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm anyone. As Thomas was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the atmosphere was a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it could never undo the pain and loss he had caused. The families of Eleanor, Margaret, and Clara found some solace in knowing that their loved ones' stories had finally been heard, and that their killer would face the consequences of his actions. Emily Harper's role in uncovering the truth earned her widespread recognition. She was hailed as a hero for her courage and persistence in bringing a dangerous man to justice. Her investigation inspired others to speak out against abuse and injustice, sparking a broader conversation about the vulnerabilities faced by women in oppressive situations. The town, however, struggled to move on. For years, it had turned a blind eye to the signs of Thomas's crimes, unwilling or unable to challenge his influence. The community was forced to confront its complicity, grappling with the question of whether more could have been done to protect Clara and the other victims. The mansion, once a symbol of Thomas's wealth and power, became a grim reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. It was eventually abandoned, its gates left to rust and its halls to decay. No one wanted to live there, and rumors of hauntings began to spread, further cementing its reputation as a place of tragedy. For Clara's family, life would never be the same. They carried the weight of their decision to the end of their days, haunted by the memory of the daughter they had lost. Though they tried to rebuild their lives, the shadow of their grief remained. In moments of quiet reflection, they would think of Clara not as the victim of a monster, but as a bright, hopeful girl whose life had been stolen too soon. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that can hide behind wealth and power, and of the importance of speaking out against injustice. Though Clara's life had ended in tragedy, her legacy lived on, inspiring others to fight for a world where such horrors could no longer occur. The finality of the verdict brought some closure, but for those who had been affected by Thomas Rayner's reign of terror, the wounds ran deep. The trial had exposed the brutal truth of his actions, but it could never undo the years of pain and manipulation that had scarred Clara and the other victims. The town, once so indifferent to their fates, was now left to pick up the pieces of its own complicity. Clara's parents, Helen and Gerald, found themselves trapped in an emotional limbo. They had never fully come to terms with the decision they had made years ago. While the trial had offered them some sense of justice, it had also reminded them of their failure as parents. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had sacrificed their daughter's happiness for the false hope of security. The guilt weighed heavily on them, and although the knowledge that Thomas would never harm anyone again brought a modicum of relief, it was overshadowed by their sense of loss. Emily Harper, meanwhile, had become an unexpected symbol of justice. Her investigative work had brought the truth to light, but the recognition she received felt hollow. She had succeeded in exposing Thomas's dark past, yet the cost of that success had been immense. As she read through the reports and evidence again after the trial, Emily wondered how many other victims were out there, hidden behind the facades of wealthy men like Thomas. She had uncovered the darkness in one man's life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there were many more stories like Clara's stories waiting to be told. In the months that followed, Emily dedicated herself to uncovering more cases of women who had been exploited or abused, often in silence. She used her newfound platform to shine a light on the dangers that still lurked behind closed doors. Her work drew both admiration and scrutiny. Many were grateful for her courage, but others accused her of sensationalizing stories or looking for horrors where none existed. Still, she pressed on, knowing that her work was a tribute to Clara and the countless others whose voices had been silenced by fear and circumstance. Back in the town, the mansion slowly deteriorated. Once a place of grandeur, it now stood as a decaying monument to Thomas Rayner's twisted life. The windows were boarded up, and weeds crept through the cracks in the stone pathways. No one had the heart to repurpose the estate, and over time rumors spread about the house being haunted. Those who dared to get close spoke of an unsettling coldness that clung to the place, as though the spirits of those who had perished within its walls still lingered, unable to find peace. The town, too, was marked by the events that had unfolded. The once tight community, which had remained passive in the face of Clara's suffering, now found itself fractured. People questioned their own silence, wondering how they had allowed such horrors to unfold without ever speaking up. Local businesses saw a downturn as tourists no longer came for the picturesque streets, now overshadowed by the grisly events that had occurred. In the wake of the trial, some people tried to forget, moving on with their lives as if nothing had ever happened. But for many, the events would never be erased. Mothers hugged their daughters a little tighter, and friends spent more time checking in on one another. The tragedy of Clara's life and death had forced a collective reckoning with the darker aspects of human nature. As for Thomas, life in prison proved to be no respite. He spent his days in isolation, his influence gone, reduced to a shadow of the man he once was. Though he maintained his innocence until the end, it was clear the world had moved on without him. He became a cautionary tale, his name synonymous with deceit, manipulation, and murder. His legacy was one of pain, and no amount of wealth or power could ever erase the destruction he had caused. Clara's memory lived on, not just as a tragic figure but as a symbol of resilience. Her story inspired legislation aimed at protecting vulnerable women and raising awareness about the hidden dangers of abuse. Clara had been a victim, but her story had become a catalyst for change. Her name, once whispered in fear, became one that was spoken with reverence and respect, a reminder of the strength it took to fight against the odds. In the years to come, Helen and Gerald would find solace in the small things. They planted a tree in Clara's memory, a living tribute to the daughter they had lost. They kept her photographs close, and though the pain never fully subsided, they found peace in knowing that Clara's death had sparked a movement that would protect future generations from suffering the same fate. The town eventually healed, though it would always bear the scars of its past. People began to speak more openly about the darkness that had once taken root in their community. They learned, slowly but surely, that silence was a dangerous ally, and that the truth, no matter how painful, must always come to light. And in the end, it was Clara who became the catalyst for this change, her story one of many that would be passed down through generations. In her death, she had become the voice for all those who could not speak, and her legacy would endure, a beacon of hope in the fight against the evils that still lurked in the shadows. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. If you enjoyed this investigation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Have thoughts or theories about the case? Drop them in the comments below. We love hearing your insights. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered.